A mother in Nineveh, in the year 700 BCE, hangs a small bronze face by the door of the birthing room. The face is a monster. She hung it there on purpose. This was not a decoration. It was a hired weapon. Its jaw is stretched into a grin no living thing makes. Its eyes bulge from a skull, half lion, half dog, half something the sculptor only knew from description. A scorpion's tail curls behind it. Wings fold at its back like a bat caught mid-fall. She has tied it above the threshold with a cord of wool. At the exact hour the light goes copper and then gray, because that is the hour the other one comes. Inside the room, the floor has already been swept with a tamarisk branch and salted at the corners, because salt burns the thing that might come crawling. A clay bowl of water sits by the bed, a sliver of magnetic iron ore resting at its bottom, because iron is one of the few substances the old texts agree the enemy cannot cross.
The birth attendant, an older woman who has done this a dozen times for a dozen households, keeps her voice low and even, the way you'd speak around a sleeping dog you don't fully trust. She does not mention the enemy by name either. She calls her only the Caesar, and even that much costs her something to say out loud. The husband waits outside, not from custom alone, but because he has been told, plainly, that a man's presence at the wrong moment can be read by the wrong listener as an invitation. He holds a second amulet in his fist, a twin to the one on the door, still warm from the smith's furnace 3 streets over, cast that same morning, because the midwife insisted one guardian at the threshold was not enough for a house expecting its first child. He does not look at it. He grips it the way a man grips a weapon he hopes never to need, and knows, with total certainty, that he will need before the night is through. She does not say its name after dark. Not once.
Not even in her own house. Somewhere in that same city, a scribe presses a reed stylus into wet clay, copying, line by exact line, an incantation series priests will still be teaching 400 years later. He is not writing fiction. He is filing a case report. He learned this trade the hard way, under an older exorcist priest who once stopped his hand mid-line over a single misplaced wedge, a wrong angle of the stylus that changed one sign into another. The old man did not raise his voice. He simply pointed at the error and said that a wrong sign was not a typographical matter. It was a summons with the address written incorrectly, and no one in this profession got to find out what answered a wrong address. The boy who trained beside him 3 years earlier had made exactly that mistake, copying a ward against night terrors, and the household that received his faulty tablet lost a child within the month. Nobody blamed the demon for that one. They blamed the hand that copied the sign. So the scribe checks each line twice against the master copy before the clay hardens. He works by lamplight in an archive room lined floor to ceiling with shelved tablets, the air thick with the mineral smell of wet clay and old dust. And he understands, the way a soldier understands a weapon's manual, that the words in front of him are not decoration either. They are the only defense a mother 3 streets away has, besides a bronze face and a sliver of iron ore. Welcome back to Esoteric Guardian. Before we go further, one clarification, stated once and plainly. What follows is derived from Mesopotamian mythology and ritual texts, not from established science. I'm not making metaphysical claims, and I'm not asking you to believe any of it literally. What I am asking is that you take it seriously as a system, because for close to 3,000 years, it was the only system these people had. Here is the part that almost nobody seems to want to discuss honestly. We were taught, by a century of horror films and Sunday school simplifications, that a demon is a thing you cast out. You find it, you name it, you expel it. The house is clean, roll credits. The oldest exorcism manuals on the planet do not work that way. In the river valley between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in the temple libraries of Ashur and later at Nineveh, the priests who dealt with these entities did not think in terms of clean and unclean. They thought in terms of treaties. A demon had a rank. A demon had a domain, sickness, childbirth, wind, the space under a threshold. A demon had rules, what summoned it, what repelled it, what price it demanded for services rendered. And crucially, this is the part that reframes everything. A demon could sometimes be hired. Not worshipped, hired. The way you'd hire muscle to stand at your door because you cannot stand there yourself forever with a sword.
That bronze face the mother in Nineveh hung above her door is not folk superstition, scraped together by frightened farmers with no better explanation. It is the surviving hardware of an actual applied science, catalogued, tested across generations, revised tablet by tablet, built by a priesthood that treated the demonic world the way a modern epidemiologist treats a disease vector. Something is attacking your household. It has a name, a method, a signature. And if you know the name, the method, the signature, you can fight back. Sometimes with a worse monster than the one at your door. This needs to sit for a moment. The archive behind this claim is not myth as vibes. It is a literal library. The core text is a series called Utuku Lemnutu, Evil Demons, a set of Akkadian and Sumerian incantation tablets recovered from the ruins of Ashur and Nineveh, copied and recopied by generations of priest-scribes who treated the wording with the precision a modern pharmacist treats a dosage.
Get the invocation wrong and, according to the texts themselves, it does not work. Sometimes it backfires. We will come back to what that backfiring cost the men who made the mistake. And the amulets are not literary abstraction either. They are sitting in glass cases right now. The Louvre holds Lamassu plaques. The British Museum holds Pazuzu heads. The same demon whose bronze face opened this script, cast small enough to be worn as a pendant or hung by a door. Its own name inscribed on its own chest, so that whoever carried it would never mistake what, exactly, they had brought into their home. We are going to open the case files, tablet by tablet, in obsessive detail. Because the interesting question was never whether these entities were real in the way a chair is real. The interesting question is why, across centuries, across languages, across a civilization that rose and fell twice over, the same names, the same warnings, the same specific rules for the same specific dangers keep resurfacing in the archaeological record, copied by hand, generation after generation, by people who had every reason, if this were merely comforting fiction, to let the fiction drift. It didn't drift. It held its shape, the way a working technical manual holds its shape. Nobody revises the wiring diagram for fun. Somewhere in this taxonomy is a hierarchy of things that move through walls, that ride the wind, that wait at the specific hour between the last color in the sky and the first true dark. Somewhere in it is one entity so feared that an entire secondary industry of counter-magic grew up around her alone. An industry with its own manufactured objects, its own supply chain, its own price list. And somewhere in it is the answer to the question this whole taxonomy was actually built to solve, which has nothing to do with monsters, and everything to do with what a civilization does when the deaths keep coming and no one can say why. A woman loses a child in her sleep with no mark on the body. A man wakes fevered with no wound. A house grows cold in one corner no matter how high the fire is built. Someone, eventually, has to have an answer, because the alternative is that these things simply happen for no reason at all to anyone at any time. And no household in Ashur, in Nineveh, in Babylon could live inside a universe that offered them nothing but that silence. So they built a bestiary instead, a rank for every threat, a rule for every rank, a weapon, sometimes literally a face cast in bronze, for every threshold that needed guarding. Keep that mother in the doorway in mind. Keep the scribe and his reed stylus in mind. We are about to meet the thing she was actually afraid of, and a thing she hung by her door specifically because it was afraid of nothing at all. I want to start with a question, and I want you to sit with it before I answer it. When you found yourself standing outside a locked door at night, listening for a sound that wasn't there a moment before, what exactly did you think was on the other side? Not a burglar, be honest. For half a second, before the rational mind caught up, you were listening for something that doesn't have a name in your language. That flinch has a history, and the history is longer than you think. Let's build the map that explains it. The Mesopotamian demonic world was not a flat crowd of monsters. It was ranked, the way an army is ranked, the way a bureaucracy is ranked. And the ranking mattered because your defense depended entirely on knowing which rank you were dealing with. Get the rank wrong, and the ward you use is the wrong tool for the wrong job. A lock built for one kind of thief, facing a completely different kind of thief. At the bottom of that ranking sits the Atuku, and here I need to correct something the word itself gets accused of. In popular use today, Atuku has become shorthand for demon in general. But in the original texts, it names a category, not a single monster. An Atuku is a ghost or spirit without a home, a wandering dead thing denied proper burial rites, and its function is almost pitiable before it turns dangerous. It wants what any unburied dead thing wants in this cosmology: a kispu, a funerary offering, food and water poured for it by name. Deny it that, and it does not simply fade. It lingers at the edge of the living world, and it feeds on what it can take instead: exhaustion, fever, the slow drain of a body that will not recover. The rule, according to the texts, is specific. The counter to an unsatisfied Atuku is not a weapon. It is a debt paid. Name it, feed it, and in many cases the danger passes, because the Atuku's whole complaint was never having received what it was owed in the first place. One step up in rank stands the Gallu, and this is where the tone changes. A Gallu is not a wandering complaint. A Gallu is an enforcer. A demon that serves the law of the underworld the way a bailiff serves a court order, dispatched specifically to drag the living or the escaped dead back to where they are supposed to be. The Gallu does not negotiate the way an Atuku can be reasoned with through offerings, because the Gallu is not acting on its own grievance. It is acting on a warrant. The oldest surviving myth built around this rank describes a Gallu demon sent to retrieve a figure who had escaped the underworld's ledger. And the demon does not stop, does not tire, does not accept a bribe, because its function is procedural, not personal. Against a Gallu, the texts describe substitution as the primary defense, offering the demon an acceptable replacement for the soul it has come to collect. This is not comforting. It means someone, or something, had to be handed over in your place. Higher still, and considerably more feared, is the Asaku, a demon whose entire domain is disease, specifically the kind of wasting fever and internal rot that ancient physicians could not otherwise explain. The Asaku does not haunt a threshold the way an Utuku might. It enters the body directly, and the incantation tablets describe its attack in language that reads uncomfortably close to a modern description of infection. Heat rising from within, the sufferer's own blood turning against the healthy tissue around it.
Its price is measured in the sufferer's strength itself, and the ritual defense against it required a professional, an ashipu, a priest-physician who combined what we would now separate into medicine and exorcism into one job. Because in this system, there was no meaningful difference between the two. Above these individual ranks sits a formation that operates differently from anything I've described so far, a group known as the Sebetu, the Seven. The Seven are not 7 separate case files. They are described in the tablets as a single roaming unit, dispatched together, answering to no fixed domain of their own, which made them uniquely dangerous to a priesthood that built its entire defensive system around domain-specific counters. You cannot ward a house against sickness, wind, and childbirth all at once with one amulet if the thing coming for you refuses to specialize. The Seven appear in the record as agents of chaos precisely because they break the taxonomy's own logic. 7 throats acting as one throat, and the incantations addressing them read less like a targeted cure and more like an appeal to overwhelming force, calling on greater gods to simply drive the swarm elsewhere. This is the moment worth pausing on, because I promised you a scene, and this is where it belongs. Picture a barred door at night, somewhere in a mud brick house on the outskirts of a city you've never seen, and picture yourself on the wrong side of that bar. You hear nothing at first, then a scrape, low, at the base of the door, exactly where a draft has no business coming from. Your hand finds the bar and presses it tighter into its bracket, not because logic told you to, but because something older than logic did. You wait. The scrape does not repeat, and somehow that silence is worse than the sound was. That reflex, the hand on the bar, the breath held, the refusal to speak into the dark, is not superstition invented by a frightened ancient mind and later abandoned by a smarter one. It is the same reflex living in you right now, tonight. Whenever a house settles and you go still and listen before you can stop yourself. The Mesopotamian priesthood did not invent that fear. They inherited it, the same as you did, and they simply did what any engineer does with an unavoidable structural weakness. They built a system around it instead of pretending it wasn't there. If that scene found something in you, take the half-second to like this video and turn on notifications so the next descent into this archive finds you in the dark, exactly where these files were meant to be read. Now, back to the ledger, because there is one entry that breaks every rule I've just given you, and she sits above all of them. Lamassu is not summoned. This is the detail that separates her from every rank below her. An Atuku can be placated, a Gallu can be bought off with a substitute, and a Saku can be driven out by a skilled Ashipu, because all 3 are, in their own way, responding to a grievance or a mandate. Lamassu acts on her own will, a demonic goddess in her own right, daughter of the sky god An by some accounts, cast out and roaming independently, with no treaty available to negotiate. Her domain is the one the mother in our opening scene was guarding against directly, infants and the birthing room, and the incantation tablets described her reaching into a house uninvited to touch a nursing child, to curdle milk in the breast, to bring fever to a newborn with no wound and no fire in the room to explain it. Because she cannot be reasoned with the way lower-ranked demons can, the priesthood's answer to her
was unlike any other entry in this taxonomy. They did not write a placating incantation.
They deployed a second demon against her, one whose only recorded function is standing at the threshold specifically to drive Lamassu back out. That second demon is the one whose bronze face opened this very episode, and we are going to spend real time with him directly. Because the fact that this civilization's answer to their worst fear was another monster, deliberately weaponized, tells you more about how they understood evil than any single entry in the taxonomy could on its own. None of this survives by accident, and none of it survives through folklore alone. The primary written record for most of what I've just described comes from two major incantation series, Shirpu and Maklu, Babylonian ritual texts built specifically around burning and dispelling, one addressing curse and witchcraft, the other addressing demonic affliction directly, both preserved on cuneiform tablets that modern Assyriology has spent decades reconstructing line by line. The Assyriologist Markham Geller produced the standard modern translations of the Utuku Lemnutu tablets that this entire episode draws from. Painstaking philological work that turned fragmentary clay into a readable case file. And it is worth saying plainly that without that translation work, this ranked taxonomy would still be sitting in museum storage, undeciphered, its warnings unread by anyone outside a handful of specialists. What strikes me most, going through Geller's reconstructions, is how bureaucratic the whole system reads once you stop looking for horror and start looking for structure. Rank, domain, function, price, counter. It reads like a manual because it was written as one, revised across centuries by people whose survival depended on getting the categories right. We have the ranks now. We have the rules each one plays by. What we don't have yet is the worst of them in full detail, the one demon feared enough to require another demon just to stand guard against her, and the specific bronze weapon a mother in Nineveh trusted to do that job. That's where we go next. Let me tell you what she actually was, because the popular image, a generic monster goddess, undersells how specifically designed her threat profile was. The incantation tablets are direct about her origin. Lamassu is named as the daughter of the sky god Anu, which matters more than it sounds. She is not a rogue spirit clawed up from some lower register of the underworld, not a ghost denied burial, not an enforcer following someone else's warrant. She descends from the highest tier of the pantheon and chooses, on her own authority, to hunt the living. That single detail is why every ritual built against her reads differently from the ones built against the ranks below her. You cannot appeal to a debt she's owed, because she isn't owed anything. You cannot appeal to a warrant, because she answers to no court. Her father's rank is precisely what makes her ungovernable. Her function, according to the tablets, is narrow and merciless. She is a threat to pregnant women and infants specifically, described as slipping into a household, to touch a womb, to poison milk in the breast, to lay hands on a newborn and leave fever with no visible wound. Some tablets describe her counting a pregnant woman's months, tracking the birth the way a predator tracks a schedule, arriving exactly when a household is most exposed and least able to fight back. She is also linked, in several fragments, to miscarriage and crib death, phenomena a Bronze Age household had no other framework to explain. When a healthy pregnancy ended without warning, when a nursing infant simply stopped waking, the tablets gave that grief a name and, more importantly, a cause. Not random cruelty from an empty universe. Her. The warning embedded across these texts is consistent. Household ritual required identifying her presence early, through specific described signs, a nursing woman's milk curdling without cause,
a strange chill localized to one room, a child crying at an hour no ordinary discomfort explains. Once identified, the standard household defense involved protective amulets bearing her own image, worn or placed near the vulnerable body, because in this ritual logic, depicting the threat and binding it through inscription was itself a form of control, a way of pinning the danger to an object you could physically manage. It rarely worked cleanly. The tablets are honest about that, too, describing cases where household remedies failed and a specialist had to be brought in, which tells you the priesthood itself did not oversell its own success rate. That's not the language of propaganda. That's the language of a working file that includes its failures. The modern echo here needs almost no translation. Strip away the sky god and the cuneiform, and what remains is a culture building an entire explanatory and ritual apparatus around unexplained infant death and pregnancy loss. The single grief, a Bronze Age household, had the least biological vocabulary to process and the most emotional need to name. We still do this. We still reach for causes when a pregnancy ends without a visible reason, still search for someone or something to hold responsible when a child's death defies explanation. Lamassu was not invented because the Assyrians were credulous. She was invented because the alternative, a universe that kills infants for no describable reason at all, was worse. So let's reset for a moment, because we've covered real ground, and I wanted to actually sit with you before we go further. We now know the ranking system, the Utuku, the Gallu, the Asaku, the roaming seven, and above all of them, a goddess demon who answers to no one. What the tablets still cannot explain, even now, even with a century of careful translation behind them, is why this exact fear of a nursing infant taken without a mark, without a wound, without a cause, produced the same design of monster independently across cultures that had no contact with each other. And that question opens something bigger than this single episode, a loop about the priesthood itself, the men who claimed authority over these forces, and what it actually cost them to hold that claim. Here's where I want to put a face on the abstraction, because a rank on a tablet is not the same thing as a mother standing in a doorway. A woman in a mud brick house wakes before dawn to check on a child who fed well the night before, who showed no fever, no cough, nothing a physician of any era would have flagged as a warning sign. The child is still, not sleeping still, the other kind. She does not scream at first.
She simply sits down on the floor beside the cradle, because her legs will not hold the rest of her, and the house around her goes on existing as if nothing has happened. The fire still needing wood, the water still needing to be carried. A world that has no intention of pausing for this. That silence in the room afterward, that specific quality of a house continuing to function around a loss too large for it, is not confined to Asher in the 8th century before the Common Era. It is a universal shape of grief, the same one described in maternity wards and hospital corridors today. The mind's refusal to accept an ending with no visible cause. The tablets gave that mother a name for what took her child. We often still don't have one, and the absence of a name may be the harder thing to carry. That is the exact gap Lamassu's cult was built to close. And it is also the exact reason the priesthood needed something stronger than an amulet with her image on it.
They needed an opposing force with teeth. Enter Pazuzu. He is introduced in the tablets and depicted on surviving bronze figurines, several dated to the 8th century before the Common Era, not as a benevolent spirit, but as something ranked among the worst of the wind demons, described in his own inscriptions as King of the Demons of the Wind, a title he wears the way a general wears a rank insignia. His face is the one from the opening of this very episode, lion-jawed, bulging-eyed, scorpion-tailed, wings folded like a bat's. He brings drought. He brings plague winds off the mountains. By every domain-based rule this taxonomy has laid out so far, he should be exactly the kind of threat a household wards against, not the kind it invites in. And yet, the amulets survive in the thousands, specifically because households inverted that logic. If Pazuzu was strong enough to be feared as a bringer of plague and famine, he was strong enough to be hired as Lamassu's natural predator, a demon whose scale of menace matched or exceeded hers, deployed at the threshold specifically to drive her back before she could reach the birthing room. Several inscribed figurines carry his own name and titles directly on the metal, a kind of signed contract cast in bronze, so that whoever hung it understood precisely what force they had brought into the house and precisely what it was being paid, in ritual terms, to do. This is the piece that should recontextualize everything from the start of this episode. The mother in Nineveh was not confused about what she was hanging by her door. She knew it was a monster. She hired it anyway, because in a system with no clean demons and no simple rescue, the only defense strong enough to matter was one carved from the same material as the threat itself.
There's a phrase in these tablets that gets flattened every time someone summarizes this material for a general audience, and I want to unflatten it, because the flattening loses the single most important claim in the whole system. Utuku Lemnu. Evil Utuku. We touched the Utuku rank back in the taxonomy, the wandering, unburied dead, satisfied with an offering and a name. But the tablets draw a hard line between an ordinary Utuku and an Utuku Lemnu, and that line is where the real machinery of this civilization's medicine lived. An ordinary Utuku is a grievance. An evil Utuku is a weapon, deployed with intent, sometimes by another sorcerer, sometimes simply loosed by cosmic imbalance. And its attack does not look like a haunting. It looks like an illness. Wasting fever, sudden paralysis on one side of the body, a headache that will not lift no matter what is tried. The tablets describe these evil Utuku prowling the streets specifically at night, entering through gaps in a door's construction, finding the sleeper whose protective wards had gone unrenewed. Layered above this, and considerably harder to defend against, stands the group I mentioned earlier, the Sebetu, the roving seven. I want to go further into them here, because the first pass only sketched the outline. The tablets are specific that these seven are not seven demons who happen to travel together. They are described as birthed from the same source, sometimes as sons of the sky god, sometimes as creatures of storm and locust, and their defining trait is that they operate as a single weather system, rather than seven separate case files. One incantation calls them a flood that no wall restrains, an image chosen with real precision, because the entire Mesopotamian ritual system was built on domain-specific counters, one ward for sickness, one for wind, one for the birthing room, and the seven were the acknowledged exception, a threat the priesthood admitted it could not neatly categorize. When a household's affliction did not match any single demon's known signature, when the symptoms sprawled across categories that should have stayed separate, the diagnosis often defaulted to the seven, because sprawl itself was their signature. This is the moment to introduce the person actually doing this diagnostic work, because so far I've described demons like they were free-floating threats with no professional standing between them and the household. They weren't. The figure managing all of this was the Ashipu, a priest whose title is often translated loosely as exorcist,
but that translation undersells the job by a wide margin. The Ashipu was closer to a combination of physician, forensic investigator, and ritual specialist rolled into one professional standing, trained for years in temple schools, working from a personal reference library of tablets, not unlike a modern doctor's binder of case studies. Here is how the job actually worked, and this is worth walking through slowly, because the method is the real revelation, not the monsters. A patient presents with a set of symptoms. Fever with a specific pattern of onset. Numbness confined to one limb. A child crying at a particular hour with no obvious cause. The Ashipu does not simply declare a haunting and start chanting. He works backward from the symptom to the cause, cross-referencing the presenting signs against a known catalog of demonic attack methods, each entity in the taxonomy associated with a specific and consistent symptom profile, the way a modern clinician associates a pathogen with a specific presentation.
A saku produces this kind of internal heat. Lamassu produces this kind of infant wasting. An evil utuku produces this kind of one-sided paralysis. The 7 produce symptoms that refuse to stay in one category at all. The Ashipu's actual clinical skill was pattern matching, taking an ambiguous set of signs and narrowing them down to the single most likely cause, then selecting the corresponding ritual treatment, the correct incantation, the correct material substance, the correct sequence of actions. Because a mismatched treatment, according to the texts themselves, simply failed to work. Say that back to yourself plainly, because I think it gets missed constantly in how this material gets discussed. A trained specialist, working from a written reference archive, matching a specific cluster of symptoms to a specific known cause in order to select a targeted treatment, is not folklore. That is differential diagnosis. It is the same cognitive procedure a modern physician runs when a patient's chart doesn't immediately announce its own answer. Symptom cluster in, most probable cause out, treatment selected accordingly. The vocabulary is demonic. The method is clinical. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it in tablet after tablet. Because the texts are not written like scripture, they are written like protocol. If symptom, then likely cause. If likely cause, then this specific countermeasure. This is, functionally, the earliest differential diagnosis system we have on record, 3,000 years before anyone in a white coat used that term. The scholar who has done the most rigorous modern work connecting these dots is Walter Farber, whose studies of Mesopotamian magic and medicine treat the Ashipu's practice not as primitive superstitions standing apart from real medicine, but as a coherent system operating under its own internally consistent logic, one that happened to locate disease causation in the demonic rather than the microbial, while still building a diagnostic and treatment methodology around that causation with genuine rigor. Farber's work is part of why serious Assyriology stopped describing this material as mere magic decades ago. A system that catalogs symptoms, cross-references causes, and prescribes matched treatments earns a more careful word than magic, even when the underlying cause it names would not survive modern scrutiny. None of this would be available to us at all, if not for a specific archaeological event, and it deserves its own moment here rather than a passing footnote. The Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, the largest known collection of cuneiform tablets from the ancient world, was rediscovered in 1849, buried under the mound that once was Nineveh, and among its tens of thousands of fragments sat the very Utuku Lemnutu tablets, the Shurpu and Maklu series, and the diagnostic handbooks the Ashipu class relied on. Before that excavation, this entire system, the ranks, the rules,
The diagnostic method connecting symptom to cause to countermeasure was simply gone, buried under sand and silence for roughly 2,500 years. We are, in a very literal sense, reading someone else's discarded medical archive, recovered by accident, and finding a working clinical logic inside it that nobody expected to still make sense. What this really means is worth sitting with for a moment before we move forward, because I don't want the clinical framing to sand down the more unsettling implication underneath it.
A society facing disease with no germ theory, no diagnostic imaging, no laboratory confirmation of any kind, still refused to accept randomness as an answer. They built a system rigorous enough to be called protocol, sourced from observation across generations of patients, refined tablet by tablet, the way any medical text is refined by accumulated case history. The demons were the wrong cause. The method for finding a cause was not wrong at all. It was the only tool available, applied with real discipline by professionals who took the job as seriously as any physician takes a chart today. And that discipline is exactly what raises the next question we need to sit with. Because a system this rigorous does not run itself. It requires an institution, training, hierarchy, and a body of professionals whose authority over life and death in their communities came in large part from how convincingly they could speak for the demonic world without ever being wrong twice. Let me put the uncomfortable question directly, because I think it's been sitting underneath everything I've described so far, and it deserves to be named instead of implied. Who taught you the name of the thing that was killing you? In Mesopotamia, the answer was narrow, and the narrowness was not an accident of history. Cuneiform literacy itself was restricted almost entirely to scribal schools attached to temple households, institutions known as the eduba, the tablet house, where boys, drawn overwhelmingly from families who could already afford to spare a son's labor for years of training, learned to read and reproduce the wedge-shaped script through a curriculum that took the better part of a decade to complete. This was not a village skill. It was not something a farmer picked up between harvests or a mother passed down at home. The entire diagnostic system I've just spent 2 segments describing, the ranks, the symptom clusters, the matched treatments, existed exclusively inside texts that only a small, temple-trained, professionally credentialed class could actually read. Picture that tablet house itself for a moment, because the barrier is easier to feel in a specific room than in a general statement. Rows of boys sit cross-legged on packed earth, each working a fresh square of wet clay with a reed stylus, copying the same line of a model text over and over, until the wedge shapes stop looking foreign to the hand. An instructor moves down the row, and when he stops behind one boy's shoulder, the boy's grip tightens without being told to. "Again," the instructor says, tapping the tablet with one finger. "The sign for water is not the sign for oil. A house sickened by the wrong ritual will not forgive you for confusing them." The boy scrapes the clay smooth with the flat of his hand and starts the line again. He will do this for years before anyone lets him near an actual patient, and his family, back in their own household, has already spent what a farming family could never spare, months of a growing son's labor, traded away for the right to eventually stand on the other side of this exact transaction. Sit with what that means practically. A household in crisis, a fevered child, a wasting adult, a birthing room gone wrong, had no way to consult the archive itself. They could not look up their own symptoms. They could not check whether the ritual price being asked of them matched what the tablets actually specified, because the tablets were not theirs to read. Every single diagnosis, every naming of the demon responsible, every prescribed countermeasure arrived through the mouth of an ashipu.
and the Ashipu was, simultaneously, the only person authorized to identify the danger, and the only person authorized to sell you the cure for it. This is where the record gets genuinely uncomfortable, because it isn't speculation. Administrative tablets survive alongside the ritual instructions themselves, and on those administrative tablets, exorcism fee structures are recorded in the same practical, itemized register a merchant would use for grain or livestock. Payment in silver, payment in barley, payment in cloth, scaled to the severity of the affliction and, tellingly, to the household's apparent capacity to pay. A priesthood claiming access to forces that could kill an infant in its sleep did not perform that service for free, and it did not perform it at a flat rate. The fee, like the diagnosis, was set by the same class of person who alone could confirm the diagnosis was correct in the first place. Imagine the actual negotiation, because the administrative tablets only give us the total, not the conversation that produced it.
A father stands in the doorway of the Ashipu's chamber, his wife still lying fevered at home, and he asks the only question a man without access to the archive can ask. "Name it plainly," he says. "Tell me what has come into my house." The priest studies the signs he's been given, the pattern of the fever, the hour it worsens, the words the woman spoke in her sleep, and names a cause the father has no way to verify against anything but the priest's own word. This is Lamassu's work, or close enough to it that the same rite applies. The priest answers. The rite requires barley and cloth, and a portion of silver for the tablet's sealing. The father does not haggle, not because the price feels fair, but because there is no second priest in the city who reads a different archive, and no version of this conversation where he walks away with more certainty than he walked in with. He pays what is asked, because the alternative is paying nothing and losing his wife to a name he was never permitted to check for himself. Here's where I want you to actually feel this, not just process it as a historical fact, because the shape of it is not ancient at all. A family somewhere is desperate. Their child is sick, or their crop has failed, or their luck has turned in a way they cannot explain, and they go to the one person in their world credentialed to say what's wrong. That person names a cause only they have the training to verify. That person then offers, for a price scaled to what the family can be made to pay, the only sanctioned remedy for the exact problem they just diagnosed. The family has no second opinion available because no one outside that credentialed class can read the file the diagnosis came from. You have felt some version of this in your own life, and I suspect you know exactly which version without me naming it, because this structure did not end when cuneiform went silent. It simply changed its script. That structure is the part worth carrying forward, because it is not unique to Mesopotamia, and it did not end with Mesopotamia. What this really means, once you see the pattern clearly, is that the Ashipu's authority rested on a closed loop that had nothing to do with whether the demons were real. It rested on controlling both ends of the transaction, diagnosis and cure, naming and pricing, danger and remedy, all issued from the same mouth, backed by a body of texts the paying customer had no independent access to. Farber's work and Geller's translations, which we've leaned on across this episode, both note the same structural detail without needing to editorialize on it. That the diagnostic tablets and the fee tablets sat in the same archives, produced by the same institution, serving the same households, who had no path to check either one against the other. I want to be careful here, because it would be cheap and inaccurate to call the Ashipu class simple frauds. The texts show real diagnostic sophistication, real attentiveness to symptom and pattern,
And there is no reason to think most of these priests believed themselves to be anything other than genuine healers working with the best tools their civilization had produced. That's actually what makes the structure worth examining rather than dismissing. It didn't require bad faith to function this way.
It only required a monopoly on the archive, sincerely held generation after generation by people who had every incentive, conscious or not, to keep that archive exactly as closed as it already was. And that is the detail that should sit with you longest after this segment ends. Because the sinister part was never a single corrupt priest inflating a fee. It was a self-sealing system, diagnosis and remedy issued by the same closed authority, operating for something on the order of 2,000 years, without ever needing to be checked against an outside source, because no outside source was ever permitted to exist. Every era since has built its own version of that closed loop, an institution that alone gets to name the danger, and then alone gets to sell you its approved answer to that exact danger. And every era has told itself the same reassuring story Asher told itself, that the arrangement exists purely for your protection. Somewhere between the tablet house and whatever version of it stands closest to your own life right now, that claim was never once required to prove itself from outside. That is not an accusation aimed at any single institution. It is a pattern old enough to have its own cuneiform paperwork, and recognizing the pattern is the only defense that was ever actually available to the people who couldn't read the archive. Keep that discomfort close, because the priesthood we've just examined did not operate in isolation from the rest of Mesopotamian religious life. It sat inside a much larger structure of temple economics, royal patronage, and public ritual, and understanding how the Ashipu's private, fee-based practice, connected to the state religion around it, is the next piece this taxonomy actually depends on to make sense as a whole system rather than a collection of isolated case files. There's one entry in this taxonomy I've deliberately been holding back, because the escalation only makes sense if you meet the worse ranks first and understand why the priesthood didn't lead with this one. Some names are not the kind of thing you introduce casually. This is one of them. Namtar. The tablets name him vizier to Ereshkigal, the goddess who rules the underworld absolutely. And a vizier in this cosmology is not a lesser servant. He is the executive hand of her authority, the one she dispatches when a debt in the ledger of the living comes due. Namtar's domain is not a single affliction the way Asaku's domain is fever, or Lamashtu's domain is the birthing room. His domain is fate itself, specifically the fate of plague, sent out from the underworld's own administration to collect on lives already marked for death, whether the living understand themselves to be marked or not. This is where the taxonomy stops offering comfort. Every entity we've cataloged so far, however dangerous, operated within a system a household could petition, bargain with, or counter through a matched ritual. An Utuku wants an offering. A Gallu accepts a substitute. Even Lamashtu, ungovernable as she is, can be met with an opposing force at the threshold. Namtar's incantations read differently. He is not described as a threat you negotiate around. He is described as an outcome you might, with extraordinary effort, delay. The tablets frame plague itself as Namtar walking through a city, moving house to house the way an official moves through a registry. And the ritual texts addressed to him read less like commands and more like appeals for postponement, buying a household a little more time rather than promising escape. What this really means, once you strip away the mythic framing, is that the Mesopotamian priesthood built a category specifically to hold the one kind of catastrophe no ritual system, however sophisticated, could actually promise to stop. Epidemic disease moving through a city with no visible carrier,
no explainable spread, no pattern Anashipu's symptom-matching method could fully contain, needed a name too big for the ordinary rules. Namtar was that name. He sits at the top of this hierarchy, not because he is the most active demon in the record, but because he is the one entry the texts themselves seem to admit, in their own careful language, might simply win. Before Anashipu ever crossed the threshold of a house marked by Namtar's approach, there was a quieter moment nobody wrote proudly about, and it is worth sitting in for a breath. A senior priest, alone in the small side room of the temple where the sealed tablets were kept, turns a single inscribed clay plaque over in his hands, the one carrying the specific appeal formula addressed to Namtar and no other. He has used it before. It did not always work before. He does not recite it yet. He simply holds it, the way a soldier holds a blade he trusts and does not entirely trust, weighing the years he has already spent walking into houses marked this way against the years he still hopes to have. Somewhere in that room, the calculation every Ashipu in this specialty eventually makes settles over him again. That the archive gave him a method, not a guarantee, and that the difference between those two things was about to walk through a door with him. That admission carries a cost, and the cost lands on the one person we've spent this entire episode positioning as the expert, the professional, the one with the archive and the training and the fee schedule. Because here is the detail the record does not soften. When an exorcism failed, the affliction did not simply remain with the patient. Certain incantation tablets carry explicit warnings that a botched rite could transfer the sickness onto the exorcist performing it, the ritual acting as a conduit in both directions, and a wrongly executed ward against Namtar's plague in particular carried the specific danger of pulling the priest himself into the very ledger he had been hired to argue against. Picture what that actually meant for the man standing over the patient's bed. He is not a distant clinician reading a chart from a safe remove. He is physically present, reciting the exact sequence of words the tablets demand, and if his hand shook on the wrong sign, the way that trainee's did back in the tablet house, if the substance burned at the wrong moment in the sequence, if the offering was incomplete, the failure did not stay contained to the patient who hired him.
One surviving fragment, describing a botched rite against a plague demon, notes the attending priest falling ill within days of the failed ceremony, described in the same clinical language used for the original patient's own affliction. Whether that priest's collapse came from contagion the ritual never actually controlled, or from a fear so total it manifested as the illness itself, the tablets do not distinguish, and I'd argue the ambiguity is the point. In this system, failure was not survivable in the abstract. Failure had a body, and it was often standing closest to the fire. This is why the later archive shows a clear shift in practice, one Farber's studies of the ritual texts trace directly. Earlier exorcism tablets describe a single Ashipu conducting the full rite alone.
Later tablets, particularly those dealing with the worst-ranked entities, Namtar chief among them, increasingly described priests working in pairs, one reciting the primary incantation, while the second stands as witness, backup reciter, and, if the record is read plainly, insurance against a solitary failure claiming the only trained specialist in the room. 2 men meant 2 chances to catch a misspoken line before the ritual sealed itself wrong. It also meant that if the working priest went down, someone remained who could name what had happened to him and continue the rite in his place, rather than let both the patient and the exorcist collapse into the same unexplained silence. You can hear what that pairing must have sounded like in practice, even though no tablet transcribes it directly.
The senior priest recites the long sequence addressed to Namtar's approach, and midway through, his voice catches on a line that should not catch.
Say it again from the phrase before, the second priest murmurs, not raising his voice, one hand already reaching toward the offering bowl in case the sequence needs restarting entirely. You dropped the binding word. I heard it. I know what I dropped, the first priest answers, low, and begins the phrase again, steadier this time, while the younger man beside him keeps his eyes on the patient's chest for any change in the breathing that would tell them the error had already cost something before it could be corrected. That practice, the second priest standing just behind the first, answers something that has been sitting quietly since the very start of this episode. Remember the scribe pressing his stylus into the wet clay, checking his master copy twice before the tablet hardened, trained under a priest who had personally watched an earlier error cost a household its child. That same caution, the doubled hand, the second set of eyes, was never really about neat penmanship. It was an early recognition, encoded straight into professional practice, that a single point of failure in this line of work did not fail quietly. It failed forward, onto the next person standing close enough to catch it. Namtar's tablets end most of their appeals the same way, not with a promise of victory, but with a request for more time. And reading enough of them in sequence, you start to notice something the priesthood itself may not have wanted noticed. A fracture running under the entire confident architecture we've spent this episode admiring. Because of the highest-ranked entity in this system was one their own experts admitted they could only delay, and if delay itself could cost the delayer his own life, then somewhere in the temple archives there should be a record of what happened when Enashipu, one of the trained, credentialed, fee-collecting professionals holding this whole system together, lost that fight in public, in front of the household that had paid him to win it. There is such a record, and it is stranger than anything we've covered so far. I promised earlier that the strangeness of the exorcist's failure would come back around, and it does, but not in the way a horror script would stage it. The record doesn't hand us a single dramatic account of one priest's public collapse. It hands us something bigger and, honestly, more admirable. An entire institution built to survive individual failure precisely because failure was assumed to be inevitable. Consider the scale of what actually survived. At Nineveh, the archive rediscovered beneath the mound in 1849 yielded tens of thousands of catalogued tablets, spanning centuries of accumulated incantation, diagnosis, administrative record, and royal correspondence, assembled under Ashurbanipal's patronage into what amounts to the largest coherent library the ancient Near East ever produced. Within that mass sit the Utuku Lemnutu series, the Shurpu and Maklu texts, the diagnostic handbooks, and buried among them, quieter than any of it, the administrative tablets recording fees, training, and the occasional note of a rite gone wrong. This was never one priest's private notebook. It was a working, professional literature, revised, cross-referenced, and copied forward by hands that never met each other across the centuries separating them. That assembly did not happen by accident, and it is worth pausing inside the room where the deliberate part of it actually took place. Ashurbanipal's agents were dispatched to temple archives across the empire with explicit instructions to copy or seize tablets for the royal collection, and somewhere in that project sits a chief librarian standing over crates of incoming clay, directing a younger scribe through the sorting. This batch claims to be a duplicate of the Shurpu series, the younger man says, holding up a fragment still crusted with the dust of whatever ruin it came from. Do we shelve it beside the existing copy or apart? Beside it, always beside it, the older man answers, not looking up from the tablet in his own hands. A duplicate that disagrees with its twin is worth more than either copy alone. That's how we find which line the last careless hand got wrong. That instinct, keep every version, let the copies argue with each other, cross-reference the disagreements until the truth of the original wording settles out, is not a mystic's instinct.
It is an archivist's, and it is the reason 400 years of drift still left us a recoverable core text, rather than 100 incompatible fragments. I want you to actually sit in that room for a second, the way I asked you to sit in the tablet house and the sickbed earlier in this episode, because the scale only means something once you feel its weight, rather than hear its size. Picture a modern excavation team, decades into painstaking work, brushing dust from fragment after fragment, each one a few lines of a much larger text, broken across who knows how many other shards, still buried or already lost. A researcher lifts one piece, turns it under lamplight, and recognizes, from a single surviving phrase, that it matches a line copied 400 years later on a completely different tablet, found in a completely different city, by a scribe who never saw the original and had no way to have seen it.
That recognition, a single sentence surviving intact across 4 centuries of hand-to-hand copying with no printing press, no shared physical archive between the two scribes, nothing but institutional transmission carrying the exact wording forward, is the kind of moment that should stop you cold, regardless of what you think about demons. It is the same feeling you get finding your grandmother's handwriting in a recipe your own child now follows without ever having met her. Proof that a specific chain of trust and care outlived every individual link in it. Continuity like that is rare in any human record. Finding it preserved this precisely, this far back, earns its own kind of reverence. Let that sit for a moment before we move to what it actually tells us. Because here is the honest structural lesson underneath everything this episode has walked through, rank by rank, tablet by tablet, and it has nothing to do with whether any of these entities were real in a literal sense. The interesting question was never that. The interesting question is why the same warnings, the same named threats, the same matched countermeasures kept recurring across centuries and across languages that drifted, evolved, and, in some cases, died out entirely, while the core taxonomy itself barely moved. Coincidence doesn't survive that kind of scrutiny. A civilization that reinvented its fears from scratch every generation would show drift, contradiction, competing versions of the same threat with no shared vocabulary. That is not what the tablets show. What they show is inherited institutional memory functioning exactly the way any long-lived profession's memory functions. A body of case knowledge passed deliberately from trained hand to trained hand, tested against real outcomes, corrected where it failed, and preserved with real discipline precisely because the cost of losing it was measured in actual households, actual fevers, actual children who did or did not survive the night. This is what the whole system was actually for. Once you strip away the demonic vocabulary and look only at the architecture underneath it. A civilization facing disease, death in infancy, epidemic, and the specific terror of harm with no visible cause, refused to leave that terror unstructured. They built rank, so that not every threat carried equal weight. They built rule, so that each rank came with a known method of attack and a known countermeasure, tested and revised across generations, rather than invented fresh by each frightened household. And they built remedy, delivered by trained professionals working from a shared archive, however imperfectly that archive served the people who could never read it themselves. Somewhere, generations after the mother we opened this episode with hung her bronze face by the birthing room door. A granddaughter of that same household sits alone in the evening light, turning a smaller, worn version of the same amulet over in her hands. The bronze has gone soft at the edges from handling, passed down through hands she never met. And she does not know the exact wording of the incantation that once accompanied it into that house. She only knows what she was told, that it goes by the door, that it faces outward, that it stays up through the hour the light turns from copper to gray. She hangs it exactly where she was told to hang it, without needing the archive, without needing the priest, carrying forward a practice whose original reasoning had already outlived the reasoning itself. Strip the specific names away, Lamassu, Pazuzu, Namtar, the Utuku, and the roaming seven, and what remains is a template, not a myth. Rank the threat, name its method, assign a countermeasure, train someone to administer it, record what worked and what failed, and pass that record forward intact enough that a scribe, centuries later, could copy a stranger's exact words without knowing they were preserving anything at all. That template did not disappear when cuneiform went silent. Every modern system built to manage collective fear, medical, legal, institutional, still runs some version of the same 4 moves, because the moves themselves are not tied to any single century or any single explanation for what's actually attacking the household. What we've been reconstructing this entire episode, tablet by tablet, is not really a bestiary. A bestiary is a list. What Asher and Nineveh actually built was a method for surviving an unexplained world without simply surrendering to it, and the method outlived every single demon it was built to fight. There is one more piece of that method left to examine, though. The part that turns this from an ancient case file into something you are still, right now, quietly practicing yourself, whether or not you have ever heard these names before tonight. What changes once you actually see the structure instead of just the individual monsters is not comfort. I want to be honest about that before we close, because this genre often promises a tidy resolution it has no right to promise. What changes is that you stop asking whether Lamassu or Pazuzu or Namtar were real in some literal sense, and you start asking a better question, the one this entire archive was actually built to answer. Not, is the monster real? But what does the fear itself do, and who benefits from naming it? Let's go back to the door.
A mother in Nineveh in the year 700 BCE ties a bronze face above the threshold of her birthing room. We opened there, and I want to close there too, because everything in between was just the unpacking of that single image. She is not confused. She knows exactly what she has hung by her house. A monster, lion-jawed, scorpion-tailed, wind-born, cast in the shape of one of the worst entries in the entire taxonomy. She has hired it anyway, because the thing coming for her child answered to nothing weaker. And a civilization that had spent centuries ranking its fears into rule and remedy had already told her, through the professionals who read the archive she couldn't, that this was the only defense strong enough to matter. Let her have this last quiet moment before we leave her, because the record never gives her a name, only a doorway. The midwife has gone still beside her, listening the way you learn to listen when a house has gone one shade too quiet.
The cord holding the bronze face sways once, caught by nothing either woman can feel, and settles. "It's only the wind," the midwife says, and neither of them believes it, and neither of them says so. "Then let the wind carry him closer to the door.
the mother answers, and no further. She does not touch the amulet again. She has already done everything the archive gave her the tools to do, and now there is nothing left but the waiting every mother in every century has done at the edge of a child's first night, trusting a defense she cannot verify because no better one was ever offered to her. That is the through line this whole episode has been walking you toward without saying it outright until now. The amulet by her door was never a symbol of safety in the way we now use that word, a soft, comforting object meant to reassure. It was a weapon, deliberately monstrous, deployed with full knowledge of what it was, because the priesthood behind it had concluded, correctly within their own system, that only a matching scale of menace could hold the line against a threat that answered to no lesser force. Here is the paradoxical line worth sitting with as we close, because I think it is the truest thing this entire archive has to offer, and it does not resolve cleanly. The only thing strong enough to guard a door against the worst fear a household can name is something built from the same material as that fear. Not its opposite, not something gentler standing in contrast to the danger. Something equally monstrous, correctly aimed. We've now closed the last thread this episode opened at the very start, the one asking why these particular names, Lamassu, Pazuzu, Namtar, the Utuku, the Roaming Seven, kept surviving across centuries of copying, translation, and empire collapse, when so much else from that world simply didn't. The honest answer, the one Geller's translations and Faber's studies of the diagnostic tablets both point toward, without needing to state it as a thesis, is that these names persisted because the fear they named never stopped being useful to someone. Useful to a household that needed a cause for an otherwise unbearable loss. Useful to a priesthood whose authority depended on being the only ones who could read the file. Useful, honestly, to us tonight. Because naming an old fear, precisely, is still one of the only ways a mind has ever found to stand still in front of it instead of running. I want to be direct about what this episode is and isn't, because that's the only closing promise I'm willing to make. This has been an awareness segment, not a survival manual, and not a sales pitch for belief. I am not telling you Pazuzu will guard your door tonight, and I am not telling you he won't. What I am telling you is that the impulse behind that bronze face, the refusal to leave an unexplained danger unstructured, the instinct to rank it, name it, and answer it with the strongest tool available, is not a Bronze Age eccentricity you get to observe from a safe distance. It is still running in you every time you feel the reflex to explain the unexplainable rather than sit inside its silence. You've done a version of this tonight without noticing, and it's worth naming before we close. Somewhere in this city, right now, someone checks a front door twice before bed. Not once, and could not tell you why the first check never quite feels finished. A housemaid passing through the hallway sees the second check and says nothing, because they've done the same thing themselves and never questioned it out loud either. Neither of them is thinking about Nineveh. Neither of them needs to be. The bronze face on that ancient threshold and the hand testing a modern lock a second time are running the same old program. A mind refusing to leave an unverified danger unattended, reaching for whatever small ritual is left to it when certainty isn't available. If this archive found something in you tonight, the calm way to say so is simple. Like the video, subscribe if you want the next descent waiting for you, and then, as always, think for yourselves and question everything, including me. Because here is the warning the tablets themselves would once said last, and it is not about demons at all. Be careful which monster you hire to stand at your door, since the one strong enough to work rarely leave when you ask them to.
The amulet by the door was never the whole archive. There is a second shelf of tablets we have not opened yet. Some doors are better left exactly as we found them.